Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home.
Hello, Karen.
Good morning, Dan. Here we are again.
Here we go. Yeah, here we are again. The year's 2023, and it is no longer as cold as it was.
Yeah, but it's coming again. I mean, it's going to be a roller coaster, and really we're just now starting to get into winter. So hopefully some of this mud will actually turn into ice and our ground will eventually freeze. But for now, we have mud.
Right. Well, I'm not going to say Christmas weather because it was a little bit before Christmas. That cold, that wind was something. It honestly frightened me a little bit going into the winter.
Oh, I'm sure, with the new house and everything.
Well, I mean, yeah.
Is it your first winter in that house?
Yes, it's pretty much my first everything in that house.
Sorry, time's all kind of blurring together for me these days. I have no idea when anything has happened.
But honestly, you don't realize. I guess, you look at wind speed. We talk about like wind gusts, right? And winds aren't going to beat as hard as they can the entire time, but you have those gusts, and they estimate anywhere between 50 and 70 miles an hour. Don't quote me on that. I'm not sure how accurate that is. That's what it felt like anyway, so I'm prone to believe it. And
well, we clocked 40 here with our wind gauge.
Yeah, and I'm on a pretty high ridge, so
you are.
It could very well have been. It felt like it anyway. But we have French doors that are on the storm side where the wind beats against the house. And I remember my wife was screaming downstairs, "Shut the door, are you crazy?" And I was like, the door is closed, but the wind is just ripping through it. Not because it's a bad door, because the wind was just extreme. And the curtains were flying up. It was,
oh my gosh,
it was something to see.
Wow, that's crazy. Yeah, I know we owe a lot of thanks to our power line and right-of-way managers that were out there in those temperatures trying to make sure that we kept the power on and no one froze to death when we had those sub-zero temperatures. So high winds, cold temperatures, those guys are heroes. So thanks to anyone listening who is a right-of-way or power line worker that was out trying to make sure that everyone else stayed comfortable.
Absolutely right. It was, and if you lost power, pipes froze. I know, I don't know how many pipes froze during that time period, but just so many people just were in such hardship going into Christmas even. Yeah.
And then the plumbers came out and they started fixing everything, and they were working overtime those hours. So, they're heroes too.
Yeah. And the following week we had 60-degree weather.
Right.
Yeah, it's insane. And, we talk about our animals being outside and having to endure all this, but during that, wind is a major factor, but another major factor is just being wet.
Oh,
so, you look at animal nutrient requirements, and, we talk about temperatures and just the condition of the fields and whether it's wet or dry, but just simply, if we just talk about mud, because right now everything's muddy because it's been raining, it's been warm, and it's just been muddy. So the livestock on average are going to require basically about 30% more energy for maintenance. One, because they're wet. And when an animal's wet, it just requires a lot more energy because a wet coat doesn't really insulate very well. It'll just draw the energy straight out of the animal and into the atmosphere. And that coat, no matter how thick it is, if it's wet, it's just going to suck that animal, the energy out of that animal. And that animal's going to need a lot more food to maintain body condition and warmth. So it's just, even when we're not talking about those crazy temperatures that we talked about going into Christmas, just having wet winds and a little, like it doesn't even have to be freezing, honestly, to start having an effect on your animals. Just around that temperature threshold, you'll see significant effects. But if you have that and mud, you're talking about compounding effects that you need to make sure that you are feeding your animal properties properly so you're not losing a whole lot of body condition. And let's remember that when an animal has those really thick coats in the wintertime, you're not going to see a loss right away. But by the time you do see it, you're trying to get that animal rebred, and it's just not going to work. And you have to put weight back on that animal. It's just going to end up costing you not only on the front end, but on the back end as well.
Yeah, and you got to think about the calves that these cows are carrying right now. You know, a lot of our cows in this area are still gestating, and you know, if you start losing body condition score on those pregnant cows, then you're going to have lower birth weights, you're going to have less milk production. So all of this kind of builds up over time. So making sure that you're adjusting feed energy amounts for each degree below that cold stress temperature, that is really going to make a difference in improving the long-term productivity of your farm.
Yeah, and let's talk about just winter feeding in general. Chances are a lot of people are feeding hay through the winter unless you have something stockpiled. So you're going to have a feeding area. And if that feeding area is nothing but another pasture, well, it's going to get torn up. It's going to get real muddy. Water's going to sit there. The animals are going to be wet. They're going to be caked in mud. They're going to have to move through that. If you're feeding hay or if you don't have stockpiled forages while you're feeding hay, because grass isn't growing right now. But if you're feeding hay now, do you know what the quality of that hay is? You need to make sure that you're actually putting the bales out that correspond to that possibly high energy demand, depending on the conditions of the winter that we're going to have. And it's not just you're putting good stuff when it's bad, but you got to put good stuff periodically to maintain it. And as you assess the weather and the conditions, well, maybe you have to keep getting good stuff, or, you know, it's okay to kind of start mixing some lower quality stuff, but you just have to know what you have.
Yeah. And you can always supplement, right? So you can add a high energy dense feed like shelled corn or soybean hulls. And then maybe if your protein levels are low, you can supplement those with a higher protein supplement as well. But knowing what you have, hopefully you've gotten that forage test and you've taken a look at it and you know what you are feeding to your animals, so you know if you need to add those supplements. And with those colder days and with this wet, I mean, even at 60 degrees, if an animal is wet and standing in mud, that will increase their energy needs. So even in these warmer but wet temperatures, you're still going to look at increasing the amount of energy that you are providing for these animals.
That's right. And I was reading some statistics on this, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but basically it broke down like this. The energy demands when an animal's wet is almost twice as much, if not more. And then a lot of times if an animal's dry below freezing, it's actually more comfortable than if it's wet above freezing. So just understand that factor of being wet is it's a multiplier for stress.
Right. And cold stress is going to occur whenever that animal is exposed to any kind of weather condition that's below their critical temperature. So for cattle, that lower critical temperature is 32 degrees Fahrenheit. That's one that has a nice winter coat. It's dry. If that coat is super extra thick, like say you've got some Scottish Highlanders, you can get down to 18 degrees before you get to that critical temperature. But if that coat is wet, like I said earlier, even 60 degrees may hit that critical temperature. And the rule of thumb is that for every degree below the critical temperature, you're going to increase the amount of feed by 1%. So if your critical temperature for that animal is 32 and it's 30, you're going to increase their feed by 2% because they're going to need more food to meet their energy needs to stay warm. And they can stay warm as long as they're fed properly. But you can't just keep putting out more poor quality hay, because remember, they're only going to put so much food into their rumen. And if the food that they're taking in doesn't provide the nutrient values that they need for those higher energy needs, then they're still not going to be meeting what they need to maintain that body condition.
Absolutely right. Yeah, and it's and when we talk about putting feed out, you also have to make sure that you're not losing a whole lot of dry matter. And once you're losing dry matter, you're also losing TDN, which is the total digestible nutrients, which is critical for these times, as Karen was saying. The animal needs that to maintain its body weight, energy capacity, and metabolism, so that it doesn't start losing a lot of body condition. And as it loses body condition, it just accelerates the process before the animal is either really sickly or just going to be very hard to rebreed and give you another calf, if that's the way your operation works. But the best thing you can do to store feed in the wintertime, obviously, is a barn.
Right. Keeping it dry and protected.
Yeah. Like a barn, you have a floor, you have walls, you have a roof. If you just have so in those situations, your losses are negligible. They're less than 5%, as a study shows. Studies have shown that if you have hay stored on the ground and exposed in 1 year with 35 inches of rain and snow, you can lose anywhere from 35 to 40%, which is, I mean, if you think about that in money, for every 100 pounds, you're losing a third, 33 pounds of that bale. You think about how much you're feeding to that animal throughout the year, the multiple years. This is when we say that by building a barn and storing feed properly and minimizing your losses, the minimizing loss factor in terms of how much money you're putting into feed to keep your animals in a good weight will pay for the barn itself.
Yeah, it will.
We're talking 33% loss, which is huge. And even if you don't want to go as far as building a whole new building, that's just because time, money, labor, whatever it is, just elevating it and covering it. So putting it up on wood planks, putting gravel down, stone down, putting the hay on that so it's not touching the ground and wicking up the water. And also just covering it with a tarp. It could be just a small tarp on top. You're still below 10%. So not that much different from a roof. Barn situations, you're minimal. But if you just elevate it and cover it, you're talking about a major improvement if before all you did was expose it. Even elevated and exposed shows about a 25% loss. So elevating it's huge, but covering it is also a major factor.
Yeah, because the soil always has moisture in it, even when it's really dry, especially with our heavy clay soils. There's always moisture locked in that soil. And so as you have that solid contact from the hay sitting on top of it, that's how the nutrient cycling system in our region works. There's moisture comes up out of the soil, starts to decay the grasses that are laying on top of it. And that's just how the system works. And so by breaking the chain in any one of those places, you can improve the longevity of the grasses you're trying to store.
That's right. So storing hay, a major factor. Another factor in hay losses or dry feed losses is how long it's out there. So the best way to minimize a loss is to put a 1-day supply every day. I'm not saying that's easy, but it is a good way to minimize losses. So if you put in a small square bale on racks, you're looking at about a 4% loss. A small square bale without a rack, 6.7%. Not a huge difference, but it can add up. If you've done haystacks without a rack and just out there on the ground, it could be as high as 22%. So just think about that in terms of what the conditions are and how much feed you're putting out as well. If we're talking about a 7-day supply, haystacks without a rack can go up to 41% loss. But the small square bales with a rack minimizing at 4%. So if you're dealing with small square bales and you're using you're using racks to keep it clean, to keep it off the ground, to keep it easy for them to feed, whether you're actually doing a 1 day or a 4 day supply, you're really not losing that much. However, if you're doing haystacks on the ground without a rack or anything like that, you're doubling your loss by having a 1 day to 7 day supply. But time is going to be another factor as far as losses go. Another thing is just the type of feeder that you're using. There was a study done in Michigan State. It was an older study, but these things haven't changed too much, to be honest with you. But they were looking at dry matter hay waste, and they were looking at cone feeders, ring feeders, trailer feeders, and cradle feeders. And what they found was that the best one, the one that had the least amount of waste, was the cone feeder. And the one that had the most waste was the cradle feeder. Cradle feeder had 14.6%, and the cone feeder had 3.5%. The ring feeder a little bit higher with 6.1%, and the trailer feeder with 11.4%. So, if you're in the market for one of these types of feeders, well, maybe the cone feeder is the best option. It's just a good way to keep the feed contained off the ground, making sure that the animals can get around it. Also, a factor again is how long it's going to be out there. Mm-hmm. And then think about the conditions that you're putting that feeder onto. Like, do you have a feeding pad that's gravel where the mud doesn't accumulate, or are they just sinking in inches or feet of mud, possibly, where the mud is going all the way up to their bellies? That's an extreme situation, but that can happen. Just how long the animals are out there, the conditions that we see. And, with the rainfall that we've been seeing here in Ohio, I know it's nothing compared to what they're seeing out west, but, that mud can really accumulate rapidly, and it can be very hard to eliminate. It's unless the ground freezes, like Karen was saying. So I guess it could change rapidly, but it can also stick around for a long time if the temperature doesn't really freeze.
Right. And you think about the long-term impacts of that mud. When those cattle are walking around on that wet ground, it is actually causing compaction, and it's going to be harder for that ground to drain and in the future. And so you're kind of creating this long-term issue of poor drainage in our already not well-drained soils. And so it really would benefit you to try to feed your livestock in a way that reduces the amount of mud. Now, yes, it's so much easier if you just put your bale or your bale holder in one place and you put your bales there and move along. You come back, next time and put another one in the same place. But the issue with that is the animals will, over time, tear up all the grass, any grass that was in there, and you just have a mud pit. And depending on how much water we get this winter and how cold it doesn't get, that is going to impact the long-term health of that particular paddock. And so, maybe it's your sacrifice paddock and it's going to get torn up and you're fine with that. But think about, how can you change your habits just a little bit? Maybe moving that container to another location on the other end of the paddock just to spread out their walking. So, feed them twice here and then move it to a new location. And also think about where the water source is, because that's another point that is going to get super muddy and can cause some problems, especially, when the animals, if it is a ground level water source, then as the animals defecate in that mud, it's going to go into the water source, and then they could be drinking contaminated water, which can then make them sick. you'll have more scours in your calves. You could experience some blackleg from the wet soils. So there are all sorts of things that can happen when the animals are drinking water that has been contaminated with feces-laden mud. So you have to think about the water sources as well and making sure that these animals have continual access to clean water. And sometimes it gets expensive to do things like install those winter feeding pads and install extra watering sources. But that's why there's your conservation districts and the EQIP funding to help you install these practices that not only are going to help your farm and help your animals, but will also help the environment. And so we do encourage you to reach out, get registered with your local conservation office, get your federal numbers all in line so that you can start taking advantage of these cost share programs that can help you improve not only the health of your animals, but the bottom line of your farm.
And water is the most important nutrient out there.
That's right.
There were studies that I was reading, and an animal. So if we're talking about cows, livestock, that's the animal that was done in this study. But they were showing that for feeder calves, the water quality made a difference of up to 1 pound rate of gain daily. So the water is crucial. If we're talking about putting weight on these calves, maintaining the weight of the cow over winter, making sure you have clean water is very, very critical. I mean, that's almost as bad as losing, hay losses in general. If you think about those numbers, it's enormous. So if you're losing hay, or if you're losing dry matter due to the way you're feeding your animals, the animals are using more energy in the mud, and then you add water that's maybe not the highest quality in there, you're talking about a real disaster situation where your animals are really going to start losing weight, and you're going to see it. And unfortunately, it will come back and you will pay for it. So I guess, yes, I did want to emphasize what Karen was saying, that water, even though we don't talk about it too much as far as like something in winter feeding, it is very crucial all the time. And in the wintertime, I would even argue that it's even more important because everything else is just a little bit lower quality. Fresh grass is the highest quality no matter what. And once you dry it down and you preserve it, well, you lose some quality. But when the field dries up, and Karen was right, you've had animals compacting in there, you have huge ruts in there. Well, you're probably going to have to drag. You're probably going to have to level the field again. You're going to have to reseed everything over again. But, at that point, one, depending on how late in the spring you are, if you're going into summer and maybe things aren't as wet as they were in the spring. So even that field drying, just because we're coming out of winter doesn't mean it's going to dry in the spring, because spring showers bring May flowers. So when you get the May flowers, and next thing you know, the field's dry in June and July. Mm-hmm. And that's not the optimal time to be seeding cool season grasses that you might want. So you might have to look at some summer annuals to kind of hold you over. And then maybe you'll get to reseed again
in September or something,
or possibly just leave the cover crop and then reseed the following season. Just depending on what you use, you do have different options, but you're going to have to make sure you drag and smooth that field out, because the worst thing you can do after something got ripped up and destroyed is to not fix the field before you reseed it, because then you're not going to have good results.
Exactly. Yeah. And you also want to think about the nutrient concentrations in those areas. If you have mud that the animals have been in for months, then there's a high concentration of nutrients as well, which could lead to some pollution issues. But also you have those nutrients all concentrated in one place, and your other fields are now facing maybe a nutrient deficiency because everything's over in that one field. And so as we look at these higher fertilizer costs, it's really important to consider, okay, well, how can I keep the nutrients that my animals are dropping spread throughout all of my fields so that they can maintain the adequate nutrient levels to produce healthy grasses. And so, you're not only are you sacrificing that one winter feeding paddock, but you're also sacrificing the nutrient value of that manure to that one location. And so, you can kind of get it back if you have a winter feeding area, and then you can scrape it and store it and then spread it. But again, that's a lot of labor. It's a lot of fuel, and it's a lot of time. And so, when we think about potential solutions to this, you can think about bale grazing, which we're actually going to be having a program on this in March in several locations in West Virginia. So if you're interested in that, definitely reach out to your local extension office and find out if there's a bale grazing program near you. But there's also strip grazing where you're moving your fencing on a regular basis, like daily. And that sounds like a lot of work, but once you get the cattle trained to that fence line, it doesn't take much effort at all to go out and move a couple fence posts and reset the electric. And so there are a lot of options that are available to you as far as how to make sure that your cattle not only have access to good, healthy feed, but also to keep those nutrients spread so that you don't have to do the spreading and so that your fields can maintain quality without having to add as many extra inputs because, are they getting expensive?
Yeah, and we just kind of went right over another practice that you can do to improve that field. Let's just say it didn't get ripped up too bad. It's still really let's say the grass is gone. You got bare soil showing. You don't really have to drag it out too much. You get a nice cold day in February. You might consider doing some frost seeding in there as well. Going from that February-March transition when you have the freeze-thaw cycles a lot more than you normally do in any other time of the year. You get a larger legume type seed. Usually it works better with the larger seed. That's why we typically talk about legumes because they're larger seeds. But just broadcasting it out there, normally it's 3 to 10 pounds to the acre because you're broadcasting, you need a little bit heavier seeding rate. With that freeze-thaw cycle, you're actually putting some new seed in there, should germinate in the spring. So it might be a way to kind of hold that field over, recover it a little bit. You're not going to be able to graze it right away until later on. But you might have an area to graze in the summertime when those legumes did get established. And then once you have something to graze in the summertime, because we're talking about spring, it's a little bit hard to just get in there and start renovating. But once you get that graze down pretty good in the summertime, you might be able to get some grasses in there. And then going into the winter, you got a nice cover. But let's not keep making the same mistake all the time and ripping up the same field because that stuff does cost money.
If you have questions about how to best manage your pasture fields with the resources that you have, get a pasture grazing management plan. There are several certified pasture management planners in West Virginia, and I'm sure there are in Ohio as well. And so reach out, try to get a plan for your pastures that best utilizes the resources that your farm has, and I guarantee you will not be disappointed with the results. Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.